please him in all of your life. May that be the desire of every one of our hearts, that we would, as we recognize who God is and how great he is, that we would indeed bow the knee before him. Take your Bible and turn to Matthew chapter 6, or a Bible there in front of you in the pew, as we continue to study real and radical righteousness and really kind of turn a corner, so to speak, in terms of the topic, in terms of what Jesus has been dealing with in Matthew chapter 5. It's all still a part of the Sermon on the Mount, of course, but Jesus now introduces a new section. And over the course of the next 18 or so verses, Christ will specifically deal with a very important topic. And the topic that Christ will deal with is the topic of hypocrisy. Notice even how Jesus brings that up and how many times he mentions it. You see it in verse 2. You see him saying that they sound a trumpet before as the hypocrites. You see him mentioning hypocrisy again in verse 5 in the next section, like the hypocrites. And then if you jump down to verse 16, again the word hypocrites is used. And so Christ is changing topics from righteousness to hypocrisy, but yet those go hand in hand. It's not that those topics are divorced from one another. As a matter of fact, they really connect with each other quite well. D.A. Carson, in his comments on this text, said the following. He said, it almost seems as if the greater demand for holiness, the greater the opportunity for hypocrisy. The greater the demand for holiness, the greater the opportunity for hypocrisy. And I think D.A. Carson nails that on the head. And that as we begin to understand what righteousness is all about, as Jesus taught on that throughout the entire chapter 5, and defined righteousness and defined the fact that we couldn't attain to his standard of righteousness, and for us to understand that, then the tendency of the human heart might be, well, I'm just going to fake it then. If I can't make it, I'll fake it. If I can't live up to that, then I'm just going to put on this outward appearance of righteousness, instead of realizing that the only righteousness I can have is the righteousness of Christ, which I receive when I place my trust and my faith in him. And then as I live out the Christian life by his grace and through the power of the Holy Spirit, striving to be a righteous person, striving to be a holy person. And so it's no wonder that Christ, on the heels of teaching about righteousness, he spends the next 18 verses teaching about hypocrisy, which, by the way, you may look at it and say, well, the Lord's Prayer is in there. What does that have to do with hypocrisy? Well, it has everything to do with hypocrisy, because in the Lord's Prayer, we see the simplicity of a personal relationship with God that is expressed in this beautiful prayer. Not a prayer that necessarily was designed to be recited, as many do, but a prayer that was designed to be the model and the outline, the structure of all prayer that comes from the heart of someone who loves God. And so we see this morning, we're going to focus this morning on hypocrisy. And I want to ask you, as we think about that, when you use the word, or when I use the word, when you hear the word hypocrite, who do you think of? When you hear the word hypocrite, who do you think of? See, we have a tendency to maybe associate hypocrisy with possibly scandals, possibly the scandals of high visibility type of Christians who have fallen from grace, and maybe our minds just kind of rewind to a few years ago and the incident with Ted Haggard, or maybe rewind many years ago to guys like Jimmy Swaggart and guys like Jimmy Baker and individuals like that. Or maybe we even think about current people on the TV that you really kind of wonder, are they the real deal, or are they just in it for the money? I mean, are they really genuine, or are they just a bunch of hypocrites? So maybe that's what you think of. Maybe you think of individuals in the Bible and you think, oh man, that person was a hypocrite. Or the Pharisees, they were hypocrites. Or the scribes or the Sadducees, they were hypocrites. Or maybe it's more personal than that. Maybe when I say hypocrite, you think of someone that you know personally, someone that professed Christianity but didn't consistently live it. Perhaps it's as personal as you may think of a parent, or you may think of a teacher, or you may think of a pastor, or you may think of a friend or a fellow believer whose life doesn't look like what they profess. Whoever it is that you think of, in reality, when we think of hypocrites, every one of us ought to think of ourselves. Not somebody else, but every one of us ought to think of ourselves, because hypocrisy is a sin which we are so quick to point out or to notice in others, and yet so slow to see in ourselves. You see, a hypocrite lives in the heart of every person. A hypocrite lives in the heart of every person. The Bible makes that clear. I mean, the Bible, by the way, is full of hypocrites. I mean, you can see example after example after example of people in the Bible who said one thing and then lived a different way. And Jesus said a lot about hypocrites. Jesus didn't cut hypocrites any kind of slack. He compared them to a lot of things, and he was non-complimentary in his description of hypocrites. Jesus called hypocrites things like leaven or yeast that has a spreading type of effect in Christianity. He described them that way in Luke chapter 12, verse 1. He called them wolves in sheep's clothing in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. He described them as whitewashed tombs. In other words, they look good on the outside, and then Jesus went on to say, but on the inside they're full of what? Dead men's bones. And so he described them in that way. He described them as concealed graves in Luke chapter 11, verse 44. And he described them as tares in the wheat. In other words, a weed that looks just like it's wheat, but it doesn't produce good grain. It's really just a weed. It's not wheat. And he described hypocrites in that way as well. So Jesus didn't cut a lot of slack for hypocrites. It's interesting, though, that most of Jesus' statements about hypocrites were pointedly directed at religious people. It's not that he was pointing it out to the world, to the non-confessing. I mean, they probably really weren't hypocrites in the sense that those who don't claim to follow Jesus Christ, or those who didn't claim to follow Jehovah, were really being genuine, I guess, in the sense that they don't claim it, and so they don't have to live it. So there's not really hypocrisy there. So the hypocrisy is a tendency of those who profess Christ, and that's what Jesus focused on. He focused on those who claimed to be believers in an Old Testament sense at least, or perhaps in some New Testament sense, but he was especially hard on spiritual leaders and religious people, and especially on the scribes and Pharisees, those who were the teachers of the law, those who were the experts of religion of the day. You see, hypocrisy comes naturally to the human heart. And that's why every one of us needs to make sure that as we think about hypocrisy, that it's not just the hypocrisy we notice in everybody else, but instead it ought to be the hypocrisy we notice right here. And so notice what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, in relationship to hypocrisy and a specific application of that hypocrisy in the life of those that he's teaching here in Matthew 6. Beginning reading in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says this. He says, take heed or beware that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in their synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. You see, Christ here is calling us to not be hypocritical in our giving to others, to not sound the trumpet so everybody hears and everybody notices. And so notice two different ideas here in connection with this whole concept of not being hypocritical in our giving to help other people. The first one is the warning against hypocritical giving. The first idea is just that, the warning against hypocritical giving. And that Jesus here begins this statement, this section about hypocrisy by saying, take heed. He says, beware. He wanted to make sure he had their attention, that they wouldn't just follow along with the religious leaders of the day and what they practiced and thinking that was okay. And so he warned them. Notice some ideas in connection with that warning. First of all, there's the responsibility. And the responsibility is this. The responsibility is to give to other people. Notice how Jesus puts it when he says in verse 1, take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men And so in saying that, what Jesus is assuming is that they're doing charitable deeds, that they are practicing some level of generosity in terms of giving to others, in terms of helping other people. And so there was this presumption, and a rightful presumption, that the people of God would be generous. The word that Jesus uses there, the word charitable deeds, or the King James calls it alms. Perhaps your translation, if you're carrying a different one, may put it a little bit different way. But the idea of this charitable deed is it's an act of mercy. And it comes from the Greek word that means just that, something that is merciful, something that is compassionate, something that sees the human need of someone else and wants to come alongside and help. And so it can take financial form in terms of giving to minister to other people's needs, or it can take just physical form in terms of coming alongside of someone and doing something to help somebody else. You see this term utilized in the Bible repeatedly. You see it in Acts chapter 3 in the account of a lame man asking for alms for the poor at the beautiful gate at the temple. And so the Bible assumes that you're charitable. The Bible assumes that we, as the followers of Jesus Christ, are charitable. And not only does it assume that, that's what was taught throughout the Old Testament. The whole concept of being generous and helping other people is consistently taught in the Old Testament. It was consistently practiced, apparently, by the Jewish nation, and that the Israelites understood the need to do that. And so you see that being reinforced in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, 35. You see it reinforced in Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 8, Proverbs 19, 17. And then you see it practiced even by Christ himself and his disciples. In John chapter 13 and verse 29, in relationship to Judas, there's a little comment that's made there about how Judas was the one who kept the purse. And as you combine that verse and other verses together in the Gospels, you find out that part of why they had this money purse, this bag of money, was so that they could help people out. They could be generous with it. They could help the poor. And so Jesus set the example. And so if we do not help those who are less fortunate, we're not even measuring up to the basics of what a hypocrite does. So Jesus expected it, the responsibility. But then notice not just the responsibility, but notice the reason. And the reason is where we run aground, okay, where there's a problem all of a sudden. The reason is this: take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. All of a sudden, that's why there's a warning, is because it was the way that they had practiced this. Just like so much of what Jesus has been teaching here in Matthew chapter 5, the religious leaders of the day, and then as a result of that, the people of the day had twisted this into something it was not designed to be. In that, helping those that were struggling was not designed to be a, hey, look at me and notice how great I am type of show, but that's what it had evolved into. And you'll notice their reason for it and how Jesus describes it there in verse 1. It says, take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen or in order to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. You see, the very word there, to be seen by men, is a word that we get our word theater from. And it's a word for making something a spectacle, careful examination, grabbing attention. And what Jesus is saying here is that giving had become something that was almost theatrical. It was a big show where people wanted everyone to pay attention to them as they gave. And it even says here that they did so to have glory from men. In other words, they wanted to look great in the eyes of man. Jesus also uses the analogy here of a trumpet. He puts it this way in verse 2, do not sound a trumpet before you. And possibly Jesus was using that in a metaphoric type of sense, kind of like we would use the term or the phrase, don't blow your own horn. And we're not talking about somebody standing up with a trumpet and blowing their own horn. It's a metaphor for taking credit and people noticing you and all that kind of stuff. Perhaps that is what Jesus is saying here, is don't blow your own horn when you give. But it's possible that Jesus here was describing this in a more literal sense, in that there was a practice as a part of the temple worship where literally they would blow horns to announce a financial need. in the temple. Perhaps something had come along, and we do this at the church where we have a special need and we'll tell you, but we don't just give it they didn't just give it as an announcement. They would literally blow a horn and call the people in the vicinity of the temple to come and to give, and that had devolved into something where people, when they heard that horn being blown, would theatrically and dramatically make a big show of their going down to the temple and perhaps at the area where the offering was being received, making sure that they took out the money and that they placed their large coins and made all kinds of noise with it. There's also, tradition also tells us that there were actual trumpet types of places where you could drop your coins, and then there was an offering place that looked kind of like the top of a trumpet, and you could drop your coins there, and your coins were so loud that everybody would notice what it was that you were putting in. It may be any one of those things, but the idea was this, that you were trying to make sure everybody noticed. You were trying to make sure that everybody saw what it was that you were doing. And Jesus is condemning that because this simple thing of just helping people, just giving an offering, or just ministering to a need had turned into showtime. You see, a hypocrite's chief concern isn't the need. A hypocrite's chief concern isn't the need. A hypocrite's chief concern is the notice. It's that people would notice him or her and what he or she was doing. Nothing excites a hypocrite more than people talking about him and his generosity and his wealth. That is what Jesus condemned. And so notice not only the responsibility and the reason, but also notice the results, because look at what it goes on to say, and that Jesus says here, there's no heavenly reward for that. There's no reward. Look at what it says in verse 1. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. If your giving is just for show, if your giving is just for people to notice you, you have no reward. And then he goes on to say, verse 2, therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from them. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. So he puts it negatively and positively. He puts it negatively in the sense that you don't get a reward from heaven. He puts it positively in the sense that that's the only reward you get. In other words, the only reward is people noticing. And I would ask you this morning, how would you compare the two? Compare the applause of heaven to the applause of earth. The applause of God to the applause of man. What Jesus is saying here, what should really matter to my followers is not the applause of people, but the applause of God himself. Because if that's what you do it for, is the applause of men, that's all you get. I mean, you could live your entire Christian life, if motivated for the wrong reasons, if doing things for the wrong reasons, you could live your entire Christian life and not get a single eternal reward for it. If your intent is for people to notice you instead of quietly doing it so that God is the one who notices. That a Christian could live their entire life for the applause of man. And the applause of man is a pathetic substitute for the applause of heaven. Don't trade it in. Don't trade in God's applause and God's reward for the reward of man's applause. So I was thinking about that this week. One of the things that came to my mind was I was given as a young person some coins by my grandmother that are collectible types of coins. And how foolish it would be if I took one of those coins, one of them that's just a penny, and decided, you know what, this penny's old. What good is it? As a matter of fact, it's not only old, it's tarnished. I mean, it doesn't look very nice. And you know what? They're minting new pennies, and I could go out today and I could get a really shiny, really nice 2015 penny, and I could take that old penny from the 1800s and take it to the bank and say, you know what? I'm sick and tired of this old junky penny, and I want one of those really nice, new, shiny 2015s. And they would probably gladly take it off my hand, and if they were the least bit astute, they would look at it and go, whoa, what is this? Yeah, I will gladly exchange a 2015 penny for that 18 whatever it was penny. Gladly take that off your hands and then quickly go and jump on the internet and find out what it's worth and and be happy that they had made that exchange. Wouldn't that be stupid? Wouldn't that be foolish for me? In the same sense, it's foolish for us as Christians to do anything for the applause and the credit, the glory of people, and to trade off the applause of heaven for the applause of people. That is what Jesus is saying. When you settle for the praise of men by giving for the praise of men, you trade an invaluable, eternal reward for a worthless, temporal trinket. Don't trade in your eternal reward. Give for God and God alone. And so the warning that Jesus gives to us is very pointed. It's a warning against hypocritical giving. But then notice, secondly, not just the warning against hypocritical giving, notice the way to avoid hypocritical giving as Jesus describes that for us in verses 3 and 4. Jesus puts it this way: but when you do a charitable deed, which again reinforces what we said earlier, is that Jesus presumes that we're doing that. Jesus presumes that we're helping people in need in some way, shape, or form. So when you do that, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. A couple of ideas here in connection with that this morning. First of all, what Jesus here is promoting is private giving on earth. That's what he's talking about here. And he uses this analogy of don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And we alluded to this in another message in terms of the slap and all that, in that they lived in a society where it was presumed that everyone was right-handed, okay? And as a matter of fact, they discouraged anybody from being left-handed. That was a part of their ancient culture. And so what Christ is saying is here is your hand of action. That's the right hand. Your hand of action. And then notice how he puts it. He says, but when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand, your hand of inaction, know what your right hand is doing. And he's using this as an analogy for this concept of private giving. In other words, it's not something that everybody needs to know about. It's not something where you want to draw attention to yourself. But it's also something where you just don't make a big deal out of giving. So what Jesus is saying is don't make a big deal of it to others. In terms of giving, give because you want to give and do because you want to do. And by the way, this is not a contradiction to Matthew 5:16. Do you remember Matthew 5:16 as we studied that verse? Where it says this, it's not contradicting it, but notice what Matthew 5:16 says. It says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Some might read that and then read this verse and say, those two are contradicting one another. He's saying, let your light shine so people will see and glorify your Father in heaven, but then don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. That seems to be a contradiction. It's not a contradiction at all. It's a matter of motive. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is, as you live out your Christian life, you're going to just naturally do things that glorify God and that you do for God that are going to distinguish you from other people, and your light is going to shine through that, and other people are going to notice, but your intent is not for other people to notice. Your intent is just to live out the Christian life, and as you live out that Christian life, people are going to think, why is it that he lives this way, that she does this, that she lives that way? And God in the end is going to be glorified. So the two do not contradict one another. It's a matter of motive. It's a matter of intent. And so our intent as Christians, as we give, as we serve, as we help, is to set out to do so in an inconspicuous manner. And if someone notices, that's fine. But that's not our goal. That's not what we're after. After all, you can't hide all your service for the Lord. If you are actively serving the Lord, you can't hide it. I mean, we don't have Secret Service Sunday school teachers at First Baptist Church, all right, that are quietly meeting with people so nobody knows that they're Sunday school teachers, or we don't have Secret Service ushers or secrets, all kinds of people that are just kind of, you're intentionally trying to hide that they're serving. No, you can't do that. But their intent is not, look at me, notice me. Their intent is to serve God. That's what Jesus is in this context of this passage of Scripture, exalting, that we don't make a big deal out of it to others. I remember when I was pastoring at Holmes Baptist Church, my last church in Iowa, getting to know some of the people from the church next door. It was a rural church, and so literally our parking lots backed up to one another. The parking lot of Holmes Baptist Church and the parking lot of Holmes Lutheran Church. We got really creative with our names there, didn't we? Holmes Baptist and Holmes Lutheran. And one of the men who was a long-term member of Holmes Lutheran was lamenting one of their practices that he didn't particularly care for. And the practice was this. At the end of the year, you know how at First Baptist we send out giving statements, and you get those for your tax purposes because it's tax deductible. Well, at the end of the year at Holmes Lutheran, they didn't just send them out to everybody, they published them. And I think he was the one who used this term. I don't think it was mine. I think he was the one who referred to it as the brag board. Where out in the foyer of their church, you had a list of everybody's names and how much money it was that they gave over the course of the last year for all to see. And of course, he was lamenting that because of some that didn't give, but others that did give, and maybe their motivation for doing that, and the fact that they were doing all this, which to me is in total contradiction to what Jesus is saying here. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Don't make a big deal out of it. Don't make it a big deal out of it to others. Give not because you're going to get credit from someone else. Give because you want to give to the Lord and help others. And so don't make a big deal of it to others. But then also, I think what Christ is saying here with the left and the right hand is don't make a big deal of it to yourself. And sometimes I wonder if we as Christians don't struggle with that even more in terms of reminding ourselves or thinking, taking credit perhaps for what we have given instead of realizing that I gave and I don't need to keep track. In that sense, to give and to forget. We use the phrase forgive and forget. I think as believers what Jesus is saying here is give and forget. Give and forget, and give as an expression of gratitude to the Lord. Give as an expression of worship, and help others as an expression of love for both, but don't keep track. It doesn't mean, again, that when we give those giving receipts that that's a bad thing, but I hope you don't memorize the quantity every year. And pat yourself on the back and say, oh, this was wonderful. Give and forget. Someone put it this way in relationship to that. They said, if you remember, in relationship to giving, okay? If you remember, God will forget. But if you forget, God will remember. So don't keep track of all that you've given or all that you have done. Give and forget. If you don't get thanked, it won't matter then. If people don't notice, it won't matter then. If nobody encourages you because of what you've done or how you've given or whatever, it won't matter because you didn't give, you didn't serve, you didn't teach, you didn't do this, you didn't do that for them in the first place. You did all of it for God. Give and do and serve because you love the Lord and you love people. So don't make a big deal of it to yourself. Jesus is saying, be private in your giving on earth. And then secondly, he's saying this. As a result of that, then you get to look forward to open reward in heaven. Notice how Jesus concludes it in verse 4 of Matthew 6 when he says this, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Notice it's your Father he's the one that's keeping track. And he's the only one who matters when it comes to that. He sees in secret, which the whole concept of God seeing all and knowing all brings a great deal of comfort to us, doesn't it? The fact that God sees you today and there isn't anything that escapes the watchful eye of God at any moment of time. That's a great source of comfort. But you know what else it is? It's also a great source of conviction. To know that God sees, that God knows everything that you've thought, that you've done, that you've not thought, that you've not done, ways that you have given, ways that you haven't given, ways that you have served, but also ways that you haven't served. And so for us as believers, our motivation has to be the watchful eye of God. Are you giving because God is watching? And if today you stood before him and it was the end of your life, and you gave an account for all that you've given and all that you've done for the Lord, what would he say to you? Jesus puts it this way in the Gospels. He wants to say to those, he will say to those who have been faithful, he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. My question for you this morning is that what he would say to you today? In relationship to all that you are giving and all that you are doing, to be a faithful steward of all that he has given you. Are you being faithful? Would he say, well done, you good and faithful servant? Or would you stand before there because you've done so many things for other people and for their attention? Would he not say, well done, good and faithful servant? What kind of a giver are you? Are you a real one? Are you a genuine one? Why do you help other people? Is it for others to notice you? Or do you do it for God to notice, for God to be pleased? Do you give out of a heart of love? Or do you give for the credit and the glory to be given to you by people? What would you have to show for your life today if you had to give an account to Jesus Christ for all that you have done and all that you have given? Let's pray. Our Lord, we are grateful for your word, and we confess that every one of us struggles with motives. Help us, Lord, in the midst of those struggles, to have in our heart of hearts a desire above everything else to magnify you and not to magnify ourselves. Lord, I pray that we would be the kind of people who want to give, who love to give because of all that you've given us, with no credit